Welcome to the Jean Monnet Center Montreal Winter 2021 Speaker Series. And we have a special talk today that is also co-sponsored with CIPS, the Center for International Peace and Security Studies. I'm Juliet Johnson. I'm Professor of Political Science at McGill and a member of the center. And I'm moderating our speaker series this term, which has the theme of Europe and memory. So we'll be starting with our speaker presentation, which will last about 40 minutes or so, give or take. We do not cut people off. And then we'll have a short presentation by today's discussant, Rose Bostwick, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. This is to let you know that the talk itself will be recorded and it will be posted on the center's YouTube page, but the Q&A, the discussion and Q&A will not. So feel free to ask whatever questions you may have, knowing that they will not be recorded for posterity. When we get to the Q&A, please use the raise hand function to indicate that you want to ask a question, and then we'll end promptly at 10:25. So today I am so happy to welcome Dr. Ayse Zarakol, who's Reader in International Relations at Cambridge University. She works on the evolution of East-West relations in the international order, the history of international orders and sovereignty, and the politics of non-Western powers. That is, she works on big questions. Among her many publications, she's the author of After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West. And today's presentation on the uses and abuses of macro histories is based on the epilogue from her forthcoming book, Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, which examines sovereignty and international orders from a Eurasian perspective. So Ayse, it's great to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. I see many familiar names and faces, so hello everyone. And thank you for making the time at such an early time to attend the talk. I really appreciate it. I'm now going to share my screen because I have some slides. So I hope that's okay. Okay, so okay. So as Juliet said, what I'm going to present primarily is the epilogue to my forthcoming book, which is now called Before the West, Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders. It officially gained forthcoming status last month. It will be forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. As a result, I still have time to incorporate feedback, so I'm happy to hear anything you have to say. I have given a number of book talks before, but I have never presented the epilogue, so this will be a first, because when Juliet asked me last year whether I had something on memory, I said, well, I'm doing very macro stuff now, but perhaps this epilogue where I kind of grapple with doing this kind of work might be of relevance to the speaker series on memory and Europe, because I think there are definite links between how you think about history, writing macro histories, collective memory construction. And even though my focus is on Asia, the book certainly has implications for Europe as well. So I do feel, as I told Juliet, as a bit of an interloper in the speaker series. At the same time, I'm hoping it will be a productive discussion given the range of perspectives. So as you can see from the table of contents, the book has two parts. Part one develops a history of the East in a way. And then part two talks about the implications of that alternative history for international relations. I'm especially interested in the questions of order and decline, which I think perhaps you will not agree, but I think they are under-theorized, strangely, in IR. There's room to grow, let's say. So in the first half of my talk, what I'll do is talk a little bit about the main argument of the book. And then in the second half, I'll focus on what I'm trying to do in the epilogue, which is essentially a methodology chapter, but I didn't want to write, just plain old methodology chapters. I kind of played around with it, and I kind of got at these methodological questions through intellectual history of particular thinkers who grappled with similar questions. So that's kind of how I'm going to go. So the book, as I've already indicated, is essentially developing what I'm calling a new history of the East for IR. Of course, East is a problematic term. Already there, we are starting from some kind of, Eurocentric or modernist terminology, what is the East? So all of those caveats are in the book, but we also have to maintain a degree of intelligibility. So I'm calling it, for that reason, a history of the East. Essentially, I wanted to write a history of international relations that does not privilege European or Western perspectives, doesn't assume that history elsewhere in the world starts when European and Western actors arrive. And I want to write a history of Asia, again, terminology used with the caveat, a history of Asia that's try to assume or try to see international relations from the perspective of local actors and their relations with each other, as opposed to their relations with Europe or in comparison to Europe. So that was my goal. In order to do that, I went back quite a bit. That's why it's called Before the West. I start with the Mongolian Empire. There's been in recent years some interest in the Mongolians for IR, some limited amount of interest, but still it's, Pax Mongolica is discussed in relation to, contributions to, European economy and so on. But I think there is an argument to be made, and I make it in the book, that the Mongolian Empire kind of acts in a similar way as the Roman Empire does for Europe, in the sense that it kind of consolidates this space, Asia, under one sovereign, and diffuses norms and institutions and practices throughout the continent, creating a degree of connectedness, interconnectedness, and homogeneity. I mean, a good example of this that you can bring to the present day are dumplings. So this map was shared on Twitter, and it's perfect illustration for what I'm talking about. As you can see, in any place that was under the control of the Mongolian Empire, you have a form of like dumplings. They're called different things, but even to this day we can see their influence. They have diffused. I don't know where they originate from, dumplings, but the Mongolian Empire diffused this food item to wherever they ruled. But of course, this is not the culinary history. I mean, this is the joking part of it. What I'm interested in is actually the diffusion of a particular sovereignty model. So one of the things I do in the book, in the first chapter, is develop a framework of comparing different understandings of sovereignty. And, there's the modern state sovereignty, which is about, supreme political authority and centralization, territoriality, external recognition. And I argue that there was a sovereignty model in Asia, which I call the Chinggizid sovereignty model, that is actually comparable in some ways to modern state sovereignty, characterized by extreme political centralization, initially not getting any legitimation from religious authority, and that extreme political centralization under the rule of the Khan, initially Genghis Khan, or the Great Khan as lawgiver, was legitimized by world conquest. So as long as you were a universal sovereign, if you could claim to be a world conqueror, you had the right to exercise this extreme degree of political extreme supreme authority. So, and I'm arguing in the book that this model kind of diffused, and you can trace it through different ages. And I'm interested in the book in a story of in a way, great powers, but they're not great powers. That's a modern term. I'm interested in diffusing the history of what I call great houses that were understanding sovereignty in this manner, and they were chasing, world empires as a result. And because they were chasing world empires, they were ordering the world. They were creating world orders, world understood in a particular way given that particular time. So they were world orders. So I'm saying that if you trace the sovereignty model, you're also telling a story of world orders before international orders of modernity. So in chapter 2, I look at the Mongolian Empire and the successor khanates. That's the first world order. Again, I don't have that much time, so I'm not going to get in. I'm happy to talk in the Q&As. This is something that somebody is particularly interested in. But this was a very connected world and a lot of movement from between West Asia and East Asia. Again, as I said, a lot of transmission of stuff. And in chapter 3, I look at what is similar to bipolarity of our time, or what's similar to what as I say, like the Cold War period of 20th century. So you have two successor great houses to the Mongolians, the Timurids and the Ming. One kind of emphasizing their connection to the previous order, one de-emphasizing, but they're both shaped by the same notions of sovereignty and recognition and so on. In chapter 3, I discuss the order that they almost created in Asia. And then in chapter 4, I look at yet another successor world order, this time created by the Ottomans, the Safavid, and the Mughals. By this time, we're in the 16th century, and recent historiography clearly demonstrates that these empires were operating. They were not just Islamic empires, but they were operating with notions of sovereignty and world empire in the manner that I've described. And they ruled over more than a third of the world's population. They controlled the economy of the globe at the time. Of course, Europe is beginning to make waves, but our traditional understanding of Europe being really interesting in the 16th century and these empires being kind of hangers on or in a European regional order is misplaced. It's actually the real action is here and in the Ming dynasty, and it's Europe that's kind of starting to hook into this old world Eurasian order. So that's chapter 4, and in chapter 5, I look at how the 16th century actually was an Asian or a Eurasian order primarily, and I look at the continued influence of the Chinggisid model in Russia post Golden Horde, Ivan the Terrible, on the Uzbeks, on the Ming, and especially I look at how Europeans, the Habsburg especially, were influenced by these models coming from the East. So I kind of flipped the traditional IR account of order creation on its head, or I link up in a way the Asian or Eurasian account with the European account. So the story is an alternative history of order making. And if I'm to illustrate it, I'll come back to this again. It just what I said now. So something like the Roman Empire in the 13th century, successor states, the Timurid and the Ming in the 15th century, and then the what I call the post-Timurid order in West Asia in the 16th century. How does this come to an end? Each actually order that I discuss comes to an end with kind of a structural crisis. So the Mongolian order comes to an end with the plague, but it transitions into something still recognizable. And the 15th century Timurid Ming, their network is disrupted by what's sometimes called the mid 15th century crisis. That's a monetary crisis primarily. And then the global Eurasian order that's being created is disrupted by the 17th century general crisis. And that's a prolonged period of unrest throughout Eurasia. You may know from European history, the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War. There's a lot of political upheaval in the European continent, but there is also a lot of political upheaval across Eurasia. Time of troubles in Russia. You have the rebellions in the Ottoman Empire, dynastic replacement in China, and so on. And historians debate as to what the cause of this was. One of the popular explanations now, as expressed in Jeffrey Parker's book, is climate change, that this was a particularly cold period, the peak of what is called the Little Ice Age. But we are essentially talking about an 80-year period of disruption, demographic decline after a period of 16th century prosperity, disruption of overland networks, trade networks, and general political unrest. And I'm agnostic as to what caused it, but this is what kind of disrupts the story of, Genghis order giving way to something similar. And there's fragmentation in the 17th century in Eurasia. And eventually, everybody kind of recovers, but international order or world order is recreated by European states, European actors in 18th and 19th centuries. So that's essentially the historical narrative that I'm developing in the book. And again, I realize it's a lot, and again, happy to take questions. The reason why I wanted to. I have a lot of motivations, which I'll get to as I discuss the epilogue. But my primary, scholarly motivation was increasing dissatisfaction with the historical narratives that we're operating with in international relations as a base of theorizing, especially going into 21st century. I think it is a problem to be operating with a sliver of history, and I'll come back to this, that starts and only really looks at Europe from 17th century to the 19th century, and the global picture really comes in only in 19th century. And I think if we want to theorize better, we need to broaden our view, of course, making allowances for what's commensurable and what's not, and thinking about, which categories travel and which don't. And there are a lot of pitfalls to this, which I'll get to in the epilogue. But the questions, the history I've just laid out could be used for a lot of purposes. But because it's essentially a story of polities similar to great powers and world order making, it can be used to think better about order and decline. So in the book, for instance, I argue that we need to separate different levels of decline because we've only focused on European Western history. We've kind of equated great power rise with order creation, with, we've conflated everything together, but we need to separate these levels of analysis. Like you can materially decline, order is separate from great power decline, and then there's structural stuff which needs to be separated. So again, it's not the topic of this talk, but that's one of the payoffs. And I think if we're going to think about, for instance, the decline of the West, we need to think beyond, just decline of the US, or we need to think in these bigger categories, and we need better historical analogs for, something of that scale. So those lessons I discuss in part two. The other thing that, this historical account allows me to do is to partially answer a question that has been bothering me since my first book, which is the historical puzzle of Eastern decline, or the issue of why did all these, Asian states respond in similar ways in 19th century to European encroachment. If the IR narrative is correct and only European order making connected different parts of Asia and the world to each other, you would expect that there would be really varied responses to European colonialism. But the fact that there is kind of a uniform response is something that had been bothering me. So, and I'll get to that because it's a question that I partially deal with also in the epilogue. So let me put a pin there, and then I'll come back to it when I discuss the epilogue. Finally, the other thing that the book allows me to do is to think about sovereignty in a more generalizable kind of a transhistorical manner. That this is not to say the sovereignty models that I'm interested in are the only models, but it's I think again we need to think beyond 20th century to think about like what forms of sovereignty and how they could manifest if we are to understand better what's coming in the 21st. Okay, so that's kind of the book and what I'm trying to do. In the epilogue, which is what I promised to present today, Uses and Abuses of Macrohistory, or it has the subtitle, or Am I a Eurasianist? I wanted to kind of directly engage with what it means for me to write this book. And for me, meaning I'm somebody, I work in the UK and I spent a long time in North America, but, I grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, and I'm essentially I have written a book about Turco-Mongolian, sovereigns and their, world order, world empire quests. So I think, one could suspect, of me of having certain political motives. I mean, I do have political motives, but not those ones. So, but I wanted to confront that question, and I also wanted to confront the question of what it means to write a macro history of this scale at a time when macro approaches in general have been kind of, discredited or stigmatized. I would say, having worked on stigma, it's just generally they are not favored in social sciences or history. The trend is to go micro, because arguably, and maybe rightly so, it's argued you lose a lot when you go to this level of abstraction. So I wanted to kind of deal with those questions, not shy away from them, because I think about them a lot in my own work. And in fact, the epilogue was one of the first things that I wrote before I wrote the rest of it. And the way I try to get at these questions is to do a little bit of intellectual history, or learn about or discuss intellectual biographies of others who kind of traveled down this road at a time when this kind of work was actually more favored, and think about where they went wrong, or which of these thinkers do I find more appealing and why. And of course, there's as I said, a playfulness to this as well, because I'm defending a very macro kind of approach in the book as doing something that is the antithesis of that. I'm at at Cambridge, where if you rank historical approaches, the kind of stuff I do, historical sociology at a macro level, it's like down here, and it's like if you're doing history of political thought, you are up here. So I think that I kind of amused myself by doing intellectual history to defend what I was doing, and I also think it's a more kind of readable way of getting at these thorny issues. It's not so easy to present, each biography. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say a little bit about, why I picked, these authors. So you can see on the left side of the screen, I have Suematsu Kancho, a Japanese journalist, spent some time in England, and then Ziya Gökalp, who's considered to be kind of the father of Ottoman sociology, and George Vernadsky, who was a Russian Eurasianist with a respectable career later in the US. So I picked them as examples of Easterners in a way, or Eurasian scholars who were like similar to my positionality, who were dealing with these issues. And then I have on the other side Westerners, Toynbee, Wittfogel, and Lattimore, of a slightly later period, who are trying to do again macro comparative history. And you know, I think the tendency to assume that only people from the region are problematic is problematic. But it's also, there's also the equal problematic assumption that if you're not from the region, you don't have anything to say. I think that's problematic as well. So for me, whether you get it mostly right, and again, how do we judge what's right or what's wrong, does not have to do with where you are from. And I think one of the problems as IR tries to become more global, as it is criticized, one of the problems is this like knee-jerk response of saying, okay, going global means just having people from particular regions. And I don't think that solves the problem. I think we have to rethink the whole enterprise without privileging any region. So for me, the solution to Eurocentrism is not Sinocentrism. And so I thought really hard about what does it mean to write history of Asia or the East without, falling prey to that sort of, jingoism or like advocating a particular nationalist view of that history, just, because of, it's from the East. So, just to say a little bit about these group of thinkers. So Suematsu Kancho, I found very interesting because he essentially was picking up, it predates him, but there is kind of a notion in Japanese historiography that Japan or Japanese rulers are connected to the Mongolians. So there's this idea that Kancho was advocating that the founder of Kamakura shogunate in the 12th century later went to mainland Asia and became Genghis Khan. So that was his theory. And, when I talk about him, I talk about how, his theory was this is a time of Japanese imperialism. And his theory resonated in that way, giving justification to, Japan in Asia. Also vis-a-vis China, also vis-a-vis Europe. So that narrative, even though Japan was one of the few places that in Asia that never came under direct Mongolian rule, that fabricated connection at the turn of, at the end of 19th century was interesting to me. And then Gökalp, as an Ottoman sociologist, he later settled on, straightforward Turkish nation-state nationalism. But before he did so, he played around with these ideas of pan-Turkism, which is like an ethno connection of Turks. Like pan-Slavism, but also Turanism, which was a view that emanated from linguistic theories from Finland and Hungary. Connection of Turanian people, so kind of a linguistic family. And Vernadsky, was one of the main names of Russian Eurasianism, this time coming out of, a geographical tradition. And I find these thinkers interesting because, in a way, if I'm right about the account that I've developed, they are not entirely wrong to see connections, because there were connections. And politically, I understand their stance somewhat, because as I discuss, going back to this question of, the puzzle of the decline of the East, and this is something I also deal with in my first book, what allowed Asia or Eurasian actors to be deeply stigmatized by European actors is the fact that they had this shared history, but by the time Europe really had arrived on the scene in late 18th, 19th century, they had fragmented. So they could be tainted with association with each other, but they could not mount a group defense, right? Because they no longer shared Asia or Eurasia as kind of a normative, social, coherent space. And that's, I think, that enemy is what allowed them to be stigmatized in a similar manner. So at the end of 19th century, we start seeing these attempts to create group narratives about Asia, but they don't work because they are already operating or mirroring categories emanating from the West, which is very difficult not to. Even like in this talk, I am using the same categories, right, because those categories have taken over our thinking. So I've already given the, kind of covered the slide. Why did all Eastern states have similar reactions to European encroachment in the 19th century, despite not having really declined in 18th century, having recovered from the 17th century crisis, materially speaking? I think it's that kind of shared history followed by fragmentation and enemy. And then the other thing that happened is in 19th century, when Europe, especially Britain, is dominating Asia, some of the 17th century crisis narratives go back into to circulation. You can see this very clearly in the Chinese case and the Ottoman case, probably the most important cases because they are the examples through which Europe understands Asia. So, in 19th century, a lot of 17th century treatises about Ottoman decline were reprinted. And then somebody like Bernard Lewis in the 20th century looks at that and says, these Ottoman thinkers, they knew they were declining from 17th century onwards, but it's actually very different stories of what's going on in 19th century versus 17th century. But it created this impression of continuous, never-ending decline from 17th century onwards, even though what I argue in the book, the decline is not material. The decline is one of, fraying of the social fabric that holds, these orders together. So these are some of the issues I get through these biographies. And then, through the biographies of the Western macro historians, I try to pick people who try to theorize about Asia or Eurasia in its own terms rather than, not Europe. And I think as we've lost, as we moved away from this type of macro history, we have lost a bit of our ability to conceptualize about the rest of the world, especially in IR. We kind of put every non-Western region, now it's called Global South, in the same basket. Whether that's mainstream IR or like critical IR, although there's a lot of variability between the experiences of Asian states versus what was happening in the Americas, and I think we are losing a lot by giving up trying to think about. Of course, the civilizational language is problematic for a lot of reasons, but if we don't do it, then, more problematic accounts continue to live on, which is the other thing that I get at in the epilogue. So, as I said, there is a problematic view of history in IR that is in textbooks. So it looks something like this. There's the Peloponnesian War, then Westphalia, and then, a bunch of stuff happens, Congress of Vienna, World War I, World War II, Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, most of you, I think, would agree this is a very simplistic story, but still, like, if our students pick up an IR textbook, this is still what they're going to see, right? And the history of order making, we tell in a similar manner, Greek city-state system, then Westphalia, and then order is, exported to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is imagined as kind of existing, as I've referred to earlier, in these like silos until European actors come and connect these parts of the world, as if they don't have international relations before Europe, or they are imagined, as proto-versions of their present-day national selves, which is also problematic. Or because Europe was defined so much by Christendom, it's assumed that these other parts of the world must have been really, these spheres of, very monolithic religions or something. So there is this narrative, and we might all agree this is a problematic narrative, but unless we replace it with some kind of alternative, it lives on. I mean, and it's the zombie of this narrative will be with us, no matter how much we criticize it for being Eurocentric or whatever, unless we put something else in its place. And as I said, what we've been doing recently under the banner of Global IR is keeping that narrative intact, but we add particular regions. So we've added the Chinese tributary system. But it's also, I mean, even that account is somewhat problematic. So we are not really, I mean, this is no disrespect. There's a lot of really good work. So I'm not, I'm generalizing now because I'm giving a talk. There's a lot of good work, but there's also this problematic tendency to see everything as just add in, instead of doing a major rethinking. Or the other thing that we do is we say we're going to really zoom in because macro histories are inevitably Eurocentric and they do epistemic violence. But doing so, it's very valuable. But again, if that's all you're doing, then you're essentially leaving the big grand narrative that's problematic intact to be taught in textbooks. That's why I wanted to in this epilogue, in this book, to think about how do we do macro history in a way that replaces the problematic narrative with and while being aware that there are problems with doing this type of scholarship. So, through the examples, the biographies of these thinkers, for instance, Wittfogel is very problematic, but there's something to recover in Toynbee, there's something to recover in Latimer, that tradition of good macro history. I think there's something that's to be salvaged there. So then if we salvage it, we replace that account with the account that I've given. Not, of course, my account is very partial too, but I'm not saying I have fully replaced it, but we think the whole enterprise together as a whole. And then, we replace this timeline. In my book, I have replaced it with something like this, right? So the Westphalian stuff becomes part of a bigger narrative, and others fill in other parts of the puzzle, and we maybe move the debate a little bit forward, is my hope. So that's it. I think, am I slightly over time? Maybe a little bit, but that's where I will stop. Thank you.